Before the story deepens, please comment where you are watching from and subscribe to the channel, because this case unfolds the way many disappearances begin, quietly, without warning, and with a single phone call that seems ordinary until time exposes what it truly represents. Emily Carter was 29 years old, a young mother known for her routines, her reliability, and the careful structure of her daily life. When she failed to pick up her son from school, it was noticed immediately. That alone made the disappearance unusual. Her husband, Daniel Carter, was the one who reported her missing. He sounded calm, cooperative, and concerned. He explained that Emily had gone out earlier that morning, saying she needed space to think, something couples did from time to time. Hours passed. Night arrived. Emily did not return. Daniel waited before calling, explaining later that he assumed she needed time. That delay would eventually become the first question investigators asked. Friends described Emily as devoted, cautious, and deeply attached to her child. She had no history of leaving without contact. She had no close family nearby, no known conflicts serious enough to cause a disappearance. Yet she was gone. Daniel answered every question, offered his phone records, and allowed searches of the home. At first glance, nothing appeared wrong. But disappearances are rarely solved by what is visible in the beginning. They are solved by patterns, contradictions, and silence. In the first hours, Daniel became the public face of concern, speaking with neighbors, posting appeals, and cooperating with authorities. He repeated the same story, using the same phrases, almost rehearsed. Investigators noted it, but did not yet challenge it. The community rallied. Search teams were formed. Posters were printed. And while the town searched for Emily Carter, few noticed that the person who last saw her was also the person controlling the narrative of her disappearance. Emily and Daniel had met years earlier, built a life that appeared stable from the outside, and settled into a quiet routine that neighbors rarely questioned. They worked predictable jobs, attended school events, and kept to themselves. To most people, they were unremarkable, which often makes cases like this harder to understand. Nothing about their life suggested danger. But when investigators began reviewing Emily's recent behavior, subtle changes emerged. She had withdrawn slightly from friends. She had started documenting expenses more carefully. She had confided to one coworker that she felt watched, not threatened, but monitored. Daniel, on the other hand, described their relationship as strained but improving. He spoke of stress, finances, and misunderstandings that all couples face. He never mentioned fear. He never mentioned arguments. That absence stood out later. As days passed, investigators examined Emily's digital footprint. Her phone showed no outgoing messages after the morning she vanished. Her bank activity stopped abruptly. No transportation records placed her leaving town. The idea that she left voluntarily weakened quickly. Meanwhile, Daniel continued to cooperate, but his cooperation had limits. He declined a polygraph, which was his right, but raised internal suspicion. He corrected small details when questioned again, not dramatically, but enough to suggest his memory was not fixed. Witnesses reported seeing Emily that morning near the house, not leaving it. A neighbor recalled hearing raised voices, something uncommon for the couple. Daniel dismissed it as stress. Investigators noted that Emily's car remained parked at home. That fact contradicted Daniel's statement that she had driven away. When confronted gently, he suggested she might have changed plans. These were not accusations yet, just pressure points. Each case builds this way, not through one dramatic revelation, but through small inconsistencies that accumulate quietly. By the end of the first week, the search effort shifted. Authorities were no longer looking for someone lost. They were reconstructing a timeline. And Daniel Carter was no longer just a concerned husband. He was the central figure in a story that no longer made sense. As the investigation deepened, attention turned inward, toward the private life that had existed behind closed doors. Emily's co-workers described her as anxious in the weeks before she disappeared. She had asked questions about legal separation, custody, and financial protections. She never said she planned to leave immediately, but she was gathering information. That detail mattered. Daniel, when asked about separation, denied any serious discussion. He said they argued, reconciled, and moved forward. Yet emails recovered later showed Emily had contacted a legal office, requesting general information. That communication ended abruptly the day before she vanished. Investigators began to view the home differently. What once seemed ordinary now became a potential crime scene delayed by time. The house had been cleaned thoroughly after Emily's disappearance. Daniel explained it was a coping mechanism. He said staying busy helped him manage stress. But cleaning removed traces. Experts know that delay benefits one person only. As search efforts continued publicly, privately investigators mapped every movement Daniel made that day. His phone showed activity at times he claimed to be asleep. His location data placed him near the house during hours he said he was driving. These contradictions were subtle but measurable. When asked again about timelines, Daniel's answers shortened. He became defensive, though never aggressive. He asked about the direction of the investigation, something suspects often do to gauge exposure. Friends who once supported him began distancing themselves. Sympathy shifted quietly. The media attention intensified, and Daniel gave interviews emphasizing hope, faith, and cooperation. He avoided discussing specifics. He repeated Emily's name frequently, invoking concern while offering no new information. Investigators requested permission to search the property more thoroughly. Daniel agreed publicly, but delayed scheduling. When the search finally occurred, they found nothing obvious. But absence can speak. No signs of forced entry. No signs of packing. No indication Emily planned to leave. That narrowed possibilities dramatically. Statistically, disappearances of young mothers without resources, vehicles, or communication rarely resolve as voluntary. Investigators knew this. The pressure mounted. And Daniel, once central to the search, now found himself isolated, questioned repeatedly, and facing a reality he could no longer manage with calm statements alone. The case reached a turning point when investigators expanded their scope beyond the house. Ground searches had yielded nothing. Surveillance footage from nearby roads showed no sign of Emily leaving on foot or by vehicle. Yet Daniel's phone data revealed brief gaps, moments when location tracking stopped unexpectedly. Experts explained that such gaps can occur naturally, but patterns matter. These gaps coincided with hours Daniel claimed to be at work. His employer records showed he arrived late that day and left early. When confronted, Daniel said stress affected his memory. Investigators requested access to his vehicle. He complied. Nothing immediately incriminating appeared, but forensic testing takes time. Meanwhile, Emily's friends came forward with messages she had sent weeks earlier, expressing fear that if something happened to her, Daniel would control the story. That message changed the tone of the investigation. It reframed everything. Authorities now viewed the case through a different lens. They revisited Daniel's initial report, noting the lack of urgency, the delayed call, the calm demeanor. These are not proof, but patterns. Financial records revealed a recently increased life insurance policy taken out on Emily, with Daniel listed as beneficiary. He explained it was for security. That explanation is common, but timing matters. Investigators learned the policy was finalized just months earlier. As scrutiny intensified, Daniel hired legal counsel. Cooperation slowed. Interviews stopped. Silence replaced explanation. That shift alone does not imply guilt, but it marks a transition. The search for Emily continued, but resources shifted toward evidence analysis. Forensic teams re-examined soil samples from the property. Cadaver dogs alerted to an area near a shed, though nothing was recovered. Defense attorneys later argued contamination. Investigators documented everything. Cases like this are built patiently. Publicly, hope remained. Privately, the investigation had crossed a line. Emily was no longer considered missing. She was presumed dead. And the focus narrowed to the person who reported her disappearance, the person who last saw her, and the person whose story no longer held together. Weeks passed without resolution, and the case entered a difficult phase defined by waiting. Investigators reviewed every interaction, every recorded conversation, every financial transaction. Daniel maintained his innocence through legal channels, offering no further comment. His silence fueled speculation. Media narratives shifted from concern to suspicion. Commentators analyzed his interviews, dissecting tone, word choice, and expressions. While such analysis is not evidence, it influences public perception. Emily's family, distant but now engaged, pressed for answers. They questioned why searches near the home were limited initially. Investigators explained procedural constraints. Behind the scenes, forensic results returned slowly. Traces found in Daniel's vehicle suggested cleaning agents stronger than routine use. Experts testified that excessive cleaning can indicate an attempt to remove biological material, though no direct evidence confirmed this. Still, it added to a growing body of circumstantial indicators. Investigators re-interviewed neighbors. One recalled seeing Daniel near the shed late at night days after Emily vanished. Another remembered hearing machinery early one morning. Daniel denied both claims. Without physical evidence, the case stalled. Prosecutors require certainty, not suspicion. Yet investigators believed the truth existed within the timeline Daniel could not reconcile. They focused on digital reconstruction. Deleted messages were partially recovered. One exchange showed Emily confronting Daniel about finances and control. The tone was tense. That argument occurred the night before her disappearance. Daniel acknowledged an argument, but minimized its significance. Investigators did not. Arguments alone do not prove violence, but escalation patterns matter. As months passed, pressure increased. Daniel's behavior changed. He moved out of the house, citing memories. He avoided public spaces. Surveillance noted him visiting a remote area repeatedly. Investigators obtained warrants. Searches followed. Still, nothing conclusive emerged. These are the cases that test resolve. When there is no body, no confession, and no direct witness, the story must be assembled from fragments. Each fragment alone is meaningless. Together, they form a narrative that either convinces a jury or collapses under scrutiny. And for Daniel Carter, the fragments were aligning in a way that no longer favored him. The breakthrough came not from a dramatic discovery, but from a mistake. Months after Emily vanished, Daniel contacted an acquaintance asking about property boundaries near a wooded area he had visited repeatedly. That inquiry raised alarms. Investigators reviewed his movements again. They noticed one unexplored location that matched the timing of his unexplained travel. A search warrant was issued quietly. The area was remote, rarely visited, and difficult to access. Excavation began. For days, nothing appeared. Then, evidence surfaced. Personal items consistent with Emily's belongings were recovered. Clothing fragments, jewelry, and a child's drawing she was known to carry. DNA confirmation followed. Emily was found. The case changed instantly. Daniel was arrested without incident. During interrogation, he maintained silence. Prosecutors charged him with murder. The trial would be complex, relying heavily on circumstantial evidence. Defense attorneys argued the absence of direct proof, questioned forensic methods, and suggested alternative theories. Prosecutors countered with timelines, financial motive, digital records, and behavior patterns. Witnesses testified about Emily's fear, Daniel's inconsistencies, and the discovery of her belongings in a location connected only to him. The jury listened. Cases like this hinge on coherence. Does the story make sense? Does it explain everything? After weeks of testimony, the jury deliberated. The verdict was guilty. Daniel Carter was convicted of murdering his wife. The sentence was life imprisonment. Emily's story did not end with justice. It ended with questions about how many warning signs were overlooked, how silence protected deception, and how easily appearances can mislead. The disappearance of a young mother became a case study in control, narrative, and delayed truth. And the husband who reported it became the reason she was never coming home. After the conviction, Attention shifted from Daniel Carter to the life Emily Carter had lived before she disappeared, because understanding the crime required understanding the pressure that preceded it. Testimony revealed a pattern of quiet control that had gone unnoticed for years. Daniel managed finances, communication, and decisions, presenting it publicly as responsibility while privately limiting Emily's independence. Friends recalled canceled plans, unanswered messages, and gradual isolation that felt subtle at the time but obvious in hindsight. Emily had adjusted her behavior to avoid conflict, choosing silence over confrontation, a common response in emotionally restrictive relationships. Experts later explained how such dynamics often escalate when control is threatened. Emily's inquiries about separation represented a shift Daniel was not prepared to accept. Investigators argued that the crime was not impulsive, but reactive, rooted in fear of exposure and loss of authority. Digital evidence supported this theory. Messages showed Daniel monitoring Emily's movements and questioning her loyalty without direct accusations. He framed concern as care, a distinction that blurred boundaries and masked intent. During trial, prosecutors emphasized that the disappearance was not the beginning of the crime, but the final step. The crime began when Emily lost autonomy, when her choices became negotiations, and when leaving became dangerous. The jury heard from psychologists who explained how perpetrators often appear cooperative early, using calm behavior to control perception. Daniel's early cooperation, once praised, was reframed as narrative management. The delay in reporting Emily missing was presented not as hesitation, but calculation. Each decision that day served a purpose. Even after conviction, Daniel never confessed. He maintained innocence through appeals, insisting evidence was circumstantial. Courts upheld the verdict. Emily's family spoke about accountability, not closure. They emphasized that justice did not restore what was taken, but acknowledged what occurred. Advocacy groups later referenced the case to highlight warning signs often dismissed as normal relationship stress. Emily's story became part of a larger conversation about disappearance cases where the threat comes from within the home. Her name was added to databases, her story retold not as tragedy alone, but as evidence of how control, silence, and delayed intervention can converge into irreversible loss. In the months that followed the verdict, analysts revisited the investigation to understand how the disappearance progressed unnoticed for so long and why early assumptions delayed decisive action. Records showed that initial efforts focused outward, on roads, strangers, and distant sightings, while the domestic context remained largely unquestioned. This pattern mirrored many similar cases where familiarity creates blind spots. Daniel's calm demeanor reinforced assumptions of innocence, allowing contradictions to pass without immediate challenge. Investigators later acknowledged that tone and cooperation can mislead when not weighed against evidence. Emily's routines, once considered stability, had actually concealed vulnerability. She handled responsibilities quietly, minimized conflict, and avoided alarming others, leaving few external signals of distress. When she vanished, that same discretion made her absence harder to interpret. The case also highlighted the role of time. Each hour that passed without a focused forensic search reduced recoverable evidence. Cleaning activities, movement of objects, and environmental exposure altered the record irreversibly. Prosecutors emphasized that domestic crimes often rely on delay, not complexity. The defense argued investigative bias developed too early, but internal reviews found the opposite, that suspicion emerged slowly, constrained by procedural caution. Community reaction evolved as well. Initial solidarity gave way to discomfort as details surfaced, forcing neighbors to reconcile appearances with reality. Many questioned their own observations, wondering which moments they dismissed. Emily's story prompted policy discussions about missing adults, particularly caregivers whose disappearances are sometimes deprioritized. Training modules were updated to stress baseline behavior analysis and early examination of intimate partners without presumption. For Daniel, incarceration brought isolation rather than reflection. Appeals failed, and public interest gradually shifted, but the record remained. Emily's case continued to circulate in professional seminars as an example of narrative control, evidentiary patience, and the cost of hesitation. It demonstrated that truth in disappearance cases is rarely hidden far away. It is often embedded in ordinary days, quiet routines, and the person who speaks first shapes the story and benefits most from time. Lessons drawn from the file emphasized vigilance, interdisciplinary review, and the necessity of challenging comforting narratives early, ensuring future responses prioritize evidence, urgency, and the protection of those whose voices have already been constrained. These principles remain central to reform discussions and continue shaping protocols intended to prevent similar losses by reinforcing accountability, transparency, and decisive action across agencies, communities, and families affected by disappearance cases worldwide over time. Always remembered. As professionals continued to study the case, attention increasingly centered on how narrative dominance shaped both public opinion and investigative pacing. Daniel Carter's early visibility created an emotional anchor that influenced how information was interpreted. His statements framed Emily's absence as temporary, emotional, and voluntary, subtly steering expectations away from danger. This framing delayed the urgency often applied to cases involving immediate risk. Experts later explained that when a trusted individual controls first impressions, conflicting data is unconsciously filtered to preserve coherence. Investigators reviewing the case admitted that early assumptions, though unintentional, affected prioritization. Emily's lack of prior disappearances, financial stability, and strong maternal attachment should have triggered heightened concern sooner. Instead, the absence of overt distress signals allowed ambiguity to persist. The case also revealed how language matters. Daniel consistently used passive phrasing, avoiding direct timelines and responsibility while appearing cooperative. Such communication strategies are common in deceptive narratives because they reduce opportunities for contradiction. Analysts highlighted how repeated phrasing across interviews indicated rehearsal rather than recollection. These patterns were recognized only retrospectively. Training programs later incorporated this case to emphasize linguistic analysis alongside physical evidence. Another focus was community trust. Neighbors and friends hesitated to report suspicions, fearing misjudgment. This reluctance created informational gaps that investigators later struggled to fill. Emily's gradual isolation meant fewer observers noticed escalation. Advocacy groups used her story to illustrate how emotional control can exist without visible abuse, making it harder to identify risk. The trial record showed that evidence did not emerge from a single discovery, but from persistence. Each contradiction, minor alone, formed a cumulative argument that jurors could follow logically. Prosecutors emphasized sequence over sensation, constructing a timeline that left no reasonable alternative explanation. This approach proved decisive. The case reinforced that successful prosecution without a body depends on narrative integrity, consistency, and patience. Emily's disappearance ultimately became a reference point for modern investigative strategy, underscoring that truth often resists immediacy but yields to methodical scrutiny. Her case remains cited as an example of how silence, when unexamined, can enable harm, and how deliberate analysis can restore accountability long after certainty seems lost. With the legal process complete, the broader implications of Emily Carter's disappearance continued to unfold across professional and public spaces, reshaping how similar cases were approached. Investigators who had worked the case participated in closed reviews, identifying moments where alternative decisions might have altered the outcome. One recurring theme was familiarity bias, the tendency to view domestic environments as inherently safe. Emily's home, once considered a refuge, was later understood as the most probable location of harm. This realization influenced updated protocols requiring earlier forensic consideration of residences in missing partner cases. Another lesson centered on emotional performance. Daniel's composed behavior initially aligned with societal expectations of grief management, allowing suspicion to be postponed. Experts later emphasized that emotional responses vary widely and should never be treated as indicators of innocence or guilt in isolation. The case also highlighted the importance of financial analysis. Life insurance changes, account monitoring, and expenditure control emerged as early warning signs that were initially viewed as routine. Training modules now stress financial timelines as behavioral evidence rather than background detail. For the community, the case altered perceptions of normalcy. Friends who once admired the couple reflected on moments they had dismissed, learning how control can masquerade as care. Emily's story was shared in educational forums not to assign collective blame, but to promote awareness of subtle risk factors. Her disappearance also contributed to policy discussions about missing adults, particularly caregivers, whose cases may lack immediate urgency despite elevated vulnerability. Data from similar cases supported reforms advocating faster escalation when a primary caregiver vanishes unexpectedly. Emily's name became associated with these reforms, transforming personal tragedy into institutional learning. Though public attention eventually faded, the case persisted within professional discourse as a reminder that resolution depends not on dramatic evidence alone, but on disciplined analysis, timely skepticism, and the willingness to challenge comforting assumptions before silence becomes permanent. Over time, Emily Carter's case began influencing how disappearance narratives were framed in public discourse, particularly in media coverage and educational materials. Analysts noted that early reporting often amplifies the voice of the reporting spouse, unintentionally reinforcing a single perspective before facts are established. In Emily's case, this amplification delayed skepticism and shaped collective understanding. Journalism reviews later cited the case as an example of why balanced reporting must prioritize verified timelines over emotional appeals. The shift was subtle but important. Rather than focusing solely on grief expressions, newer frameworks emphasized inconsistencies, chronology, and corroboration. This recalibration affected how future cases were presented to the public. Emily's disappearance also exposed how gendered expectations influence interpretation. As a mother, her absence was initially rationalized through emotional explanations rather than treated as an immediate crisis. Experts argued that assumptions about caregiving roles can obscure danger, particularly when women are perceived as resilient or self-sacrificing. Emily's history of accommodating others reinforced these assumptions, making her disappearance easier to misinterpret. The case further demonstrated how technology can both obscure and reveal truth. While digital gaps complicated early analysis, recovered data ultimately provided structure to the timeline that testimony alone could not. Investigators stressed that technology should supplement, not replace, behavioral assessment. Emily's digital footprint, once reconstructed, told a coherent story of constraint and preparation, contradicting claims of impulsive departure. The legal outcome also influenced prosecutorial strategy nationwide. Prosecutors increasingly relied on narrative sequencing, emphasizing motive, opportunity, and behavior rather than waiting for definitive physical evidence. Emily's case became a teaching example of how circumstantial evidence, when organized logically, can meet the standard of proof beyond reasonable doubt. For families of missing persons, the case underscored the importance of persistence. Emily's relatives continued advocating even when momentum slowed, reminding authorities that absence itself is evidence when it violates established patterns. Their resolve contributed to sustained investigative focus. Though years passed, Emily's name remained tied to reform discussions, ensuring that her disappearance would continue shaping how silence, control, and delayed response are understood in the pursuit of justice. As the case entered long-term review, specialists examined how institutional caution, though well-intentioned, can unintentionally enable harm when applied without contextual urgency. In Emily Carter's disappearance, protocol required confirmation before escalation, Yet confirmation itself depended on time-sensitive evidence that diminished with delay. Analysts concluded that rigid sequencing sometimes conflicts with behavioral reality. Emily's absence violated her established patterns immediately, but the system treated it as ambiguous until proof emerged. That gap became a central lesson. Training revisions emphasized that pattern disruption, not proof of crime, should trigger rapid escalation in intimate partner disappearances. The case also prompted renewed focus on power dynamics within relationships. Experts testified that control often intensifies during periods of transition, such as discussions of separation or financial independence. Emily's inquiries about legal options represented a critical inflection point that Daniel perceived as loss of control. Investigators later framed the crime as preventative, designed to stop change rather than respond to conflict. This interpretation reshaped how motive is taught in similar cases. Rather than seeking anger or rage, analysts now examine fear of exposure and loss. The case further illustrated how cooperative behavior can function as strategy. Daniel's early openness allowed him to influence pacing, access, and assumptions. Investigators learned that cooperation must be evaluated alongside consistency, not treated as evidence of innocence. Emily's story also influenced victim advocacy frameworks. Counselors referenced her gradual isolation as an example of how support networks erode quietly. Programs began encouraging proactive check-ins when communication patterns shift, especially for caregivers. The legal record showed that Emily had attempted to preserve normalcy, believing restraint would prevent escalation. This belief, common among those experiencing control, proved tragically misplaced. Her disappearance reinforced the need for earlier intervention and external validation of concerns. Though the verdict closed the case legally, its educational life expanded. Emily's file became required reading in investigative psychology courses, emphasizing integration of behavioral, financial, and digital evidence. The overarching conclusion was clear. Disappearances rooted in domestic control rarely announce themselves loudly. They unfold through silence, routine, and misplaced trust. Emily Carter's case endures as a reminder that recognizing disruption early is not suspicion, but protection, and that waiting for certainty can cost irreplaceable time when patterns already speak. In professional reflections that followed, Emily Carter's disappearance became a reference point for examining how accountability unfolds long after a verdict is reached. While Daniel Carter was imprisoned, discussions shifted toward systemic responsibility and the shared roles institutions and communities play in prevention. Review boards emphasized that no single failure caused the outcome, but rather a sequence of reasonable decisions that collectively produced delay. This distinction mattered because it framed reform as refinement rather than blame. Investigators who reviewed the case stressed the importance of adaptive judgment, the ability to depart from routine when contextual signals demand urgency. Emily's consistent behavior, strong maternal attachment, and sudden silence formed a pattern that should have overridden procedural hesitation. The case also underscored how perception of normalcy can shield abnormal control. Daniel's reliability, employment, and social composure created an image that resisted scrutiny. Experts noted that perpetrators often invest heavily in appearing dependable, understanding that credibility buys time. Emily's disappearance demonstrated how this investment pays dividends when narratives are accepted unchallenged. Another area of focus involved memory reconstruction. Daniel's shifting timelines illustrated how narrative flexibility can function defensively, allowing adjustments as new information emerges. Analysts highlighted that genuine memory errors tend to be random, while strategic inconsistencies align with exposure risk. This distinction became a teaching point in interview training. The case further influenced how investigators interpret absence of emotion. Daniel's restraint was initially perceived as stability, but later understood as affect control. Psychologists cautioned against equating emotional display with truthfulness, emphasizing baseline comparison over expectation. Emily's story also impacted community engagement strategies. Programs were developed encouraging neighbors and colleagues to report deviations without fear of overreaction. Her gradual isolation illustrated how respect for privacy can unintentionally enable harm. Ultimately, Emily Carter's disappearance reshaped professional understanding of how ordinary lives can conceal extraordinary risk. The enduring lesson was not that warning signs were invisible, but that they were quiet. Her case reinforced that effective prevention depends on listening to patterns rather than waiting for proof, questioning coherence rather than accepting comfort, and recognizing that silence, when it breaks routine, is itself a form of evidence demanding action. As years passed, Emily Carter's case remained active in academic and investigative literature, not because of unanswered questions, but because of the clarity it eventually provided about escalation and denial. Analysts revisiting the timeline emphasized how early explanations can become psychological anchors, shaping interpretation long after evidence begins to diverge. Daniel's initial framing of Emily's absence as emotional withdrawal established a narrative that felt plausible enough to delay confrontation. This anchoring effect was later identified as a cognitive obstacle investigators must actively counter. Training materials now include exercises designed to disrupt early assumptions, forcing alternative hypotheses to remain active longer. The case also influenced how missing person interviews are conducted. Investigators learned to separate cooperation from credibility, recognizing that access and politeness do not equate to transparency. Emily's disappearance illustrated how strategic openness can coexist with deception. Another lesson involved documentation. Minor inconsistencies, once recorded systematically, gained weight over time. Analysts noted that meticulous logging of small deviations created a framework that ultimately supported prosecution. Without that discipline, the case might have remained unresolved. The legal community also drew insight from jury dynamics. Jurors reported that the absence of a single dramatic piece of evidence made the story feel more authentic, mirroring how real life unfolds. They responded to coherence rather than shock, underscoring the value of narrative integrity. Emily's case further contributed to discourse on risk assessment in intimate relationships. Experts highlighted that control does not require violence to be dangerous. Monitoring, restriction, and isolation can signal escalating risk long before physical harm occurs. Emily's efforts to regain autonomy, though measured, triggered a response rooted in fear of loss. This dynamic reframed how motive is evaluated. Rather than focusing on anger, investigators now consider perceived threat to control. The case also influenced advocacy messaging, encouraging individuals to trust discomfort even when explanations appear reasonable. Emily's disappearance became a reminder that safety concerns do not require validation through crisis. They require attention. Her story continues to inform policy, training, and public awareness, reinforcing the principle that prevention depends not on predicting violence, but on responding decisively when patterns break, silence emerges, and explanations no longer align with lived reality. Within correctional psychology studies, Daniel Carter's behavior following conviction became another area of analysis, not for sympathy, but for understanding denial persistence. Records indicated that Daniel maintained innocence consistently, refusing participation in rehabilitative programs that required acknowledgement of responsibility. Experts noted that such refusal often reflects an ongoing need for narrative control, even after consequences are fixed. This observation fed back into investigative understanding, reinforcing how deeply narrative ownership can motivate behavior. Meanwhile, Emily Carter's case influenced how victim histories are reconstructed posthumously. Rather than defining victims solely by their final moments, analysts emphasized restoring the full context of their lives. Emily was described not only as missing or murdered, but as a mother, professional, and individual navigating change. This reframing mattered because it countered reductionism and honored agency. It also revealed how much effort Emily invested in maintaining stability despite growing constraint. Advocacy groups adopted this approach, ensuring that victims are represented as complex individuals rather than cautionary symbols. The case also affected how digital evidence is preserved. Investigators stressed the importance of early device isolation and data capture, noting that delayed access risks permanent loss. Emily's partial data recovery proved decisive, but only narrowly. This prompted procedural updates requiring faster warrants when pattern disruption is evident. Community education initiatives emerged as well. Workshops used Emily's story to illustrate how support can be offered without intrusion, encouraging friends and colleagues to check in when communication changes. These initiatives emphasize that concern does not equal accusation. They aim to normalize intervention before crisis. Emily's disappearance also prompted dialogue about caregiver vulnerability. As primary caregivers, individuals like Emily often suppress personal distress to maintain routine, making their sudden absence more alarming. Policy advocates used her case to argue for prioritized response protocols in such situations. Though public attention waned, Emily's name remained present in reform efforts. Her story continues shaping systems designed to notice sooner, question earlier, and respond faster when silence replaces routine and explanations no longer hold. In broader cultural analysis, Emily Carter's case contributed to shifting perceptions of what constitutes danger within ordinary relationships. Commentators observe that popular narratives often associate risk with volatility, yet Emily's experience demonstrated that stability can mask escalation. Daniel's predictability and composure created an environment where control appeared orderly rather than threatening. This distinction became central to educational outreach, emphasizing that danger is not always chaotic. The case also influenced how institutions evaluate credibility. Early trust placed in Daniel stemmed from shared social markers, employment, parenthood, and consistency. Analysts later argued that such markers should be treated as neutral rather than reassuring. Emily's disappearance illustrated how credibility assessments must rely on evidence alignment rather than character impressions. This principle gained traction in investigative training. The case further highlighted how absence itself communicates. Emily's failure to perform routine actions, particularly those involving her child, was one of the strongest indicators that something was wrong. Investigators later emphasized that disruption of caregiving behavior warrants immediate escalation. This insight informed updated guidelines. Legal scholars also examined jury reasoning in the case, noting how jurors relied on cumulative logic rather than emotional persuasion. They responded to sequence, motive, and opportunity presented coherently. This reinforced prosecutorial strategies, favoring methodical presentation over dramatization. Emily's case also influenced support services for families of the missing. Counselors highlighted the emotional toll of prolonged uncertainty and the importance of sustained communication with authorities. Emily's relatives described how advocacy required endurance rather than intensity, a lesson incorporated into family liaison training. As time passed, the case continued to surface in comparative studies, often cited alongside others where domestic control preceded disappearance. Analysts identified recurring patterns, reinforcing the universality of the lessons learned. Emily Carter's story remains relevant not because it was unusual, but because it was ordinary. It demonstrated how risk can develop quietly, how trust can delay action, and how accountability ultimately depends on the willingness to question coherence before silence hardens into permanence. The enduring relevance of Emily Carter's disappearance lies in its capacity to inform prevention without relying on hindsight alone. Specialists emphasize that the warning signs present before her disappearance were identifiable, though easily minimized. Emily's gradual withdrawal, financial scrutiny, and exploration of independence formed a constellation of indicators that collectively signaled transition risk. Training programs now teach investigators and support professionals to recognize such clusters rather than isolated behaviors. The case also reinforced the importance of interdisciplinary collaboration. Digital analysts, financial investigators, behavioral specialists, and field officers each contributed pieces that only gained meaning when integrated. Emily's story illustrated that no single discipline holds the full picture. This insight influenced task force models, promoting earlier collaboration across units. The case further reshaped how institutions communicate uncertainty. Investigators acknowledged that early ambiguity can coexist with decisive action. Waiting for certainty, they learned, can be more dangerous than acting on probability when patterns strongly suggest harm. Emily's disappearance became an example of why escalation thresholds must be flexible. Public education efforts also drew from the case, encouraging individuals to document concerns and seek advice when relationship dynamics shift. Emily's experience showed how internal doubt can delay help seeking, especially when control is subtle. Advocates emphasize that questioning one's situation is not betrayal, but self-preservation. The legal record continued to influence appeals jurisprudence, affirming that circumstantial evidence, when comprehensive, satisfies evidentiary standards. Courts cited the case when addressing challenges to narrative-based prosecutions. Emily's name became associated with this precedent, reinforcing her impact beyond personal tragedy. Though years separated the crime from current practice, the principles derived remained active. Emily Carter's disappearance continues shaping how institutions interpret silence, challenge early narratives, and prioritize action when routine collapses without explanation. In retrospective interviews, professionals involved in the case described how emotional neutrality proved both difficult and necessary. Emily's disappearance evoked empathy, but effective analysis required detachment from appearances. This balance became a focal point in training, teaching investigators to care without compromising scrutiny. The case also illuminated how delayed confrontation can entrench deception. Daniel's narrative, once established, adapted to new information, requiring increasing effort to dismantle. Analysts emphasize that early challenge limits this adaptability. Emily's story reinforced the value of timely skepticism. Another lesson involved record continuity. Detailed documentation from the first report onward preserved investigative integrity, allowing later review to reconstruct decision-making accurately. This continuity proved essential during trial and appeals. Without it, the case might have fractured under challenge. The case further influenced how disappearance timelines are constructed. Investigators learned to prioritize last known normal moments rather than last sightings alone. Emily's final routine actions provided critical context that reframed her absence as immediate danger. This approach now features prominently in investigative protocols. Community response also evolved. Programs encouraging collective vigilance emerged, emphasizing shared responsibility without fostering suspicion. Emily's neighbors reflected on missed opportunities, contributing to a broader understanding of how communities can support early intervention. The case additionally impacted how missing person statistics are interpreted. Analysts argued that aggregate data can obscure individual risk factors, advocating for contextual assessment over categorization. Emily's disappearance exemplified how outliers demand attention even when numbers suggest otherwise. As the case continued to inform practice, its narrative shifted from loss to learning. Emily Carter's story became a reference point not for fear, but for improvement, illustrating how systems can adapt when silence is recognized as a signal rather than an absence. As institutional memory absorbed the lessons of Emily Carter's disappearance, emphasis increasingly shifted toward sustaining change rather than commemorating tragedy. Review panels stressed that reforms must be practiced consistently to remain effective. Emily's case influenced checklists, training simulations, and policy language, embedding its lessons into routine operations. This integration ensured that insights did not fade with personnel turnover. The case also contributed to evolving discourse on trust. Analysts argued that trust, while essential, must remain conditional within investigative contexts. Emily's disappearance showed how unconditional trust can obscure inquiry. This recalibration influenced professional ethics discussions, balancing respect with verification. The legal outcome further reinforced public understanding of justice without spectacle. The conviction demonstrated that accountability does not require sensational evidence, only coherence and persistence. This message resonated widely, countering narratives that equate justice with immediacy. Emily's family continued engaging in advocacy, focusing on prevention rather than remembrance alone. Their efforts supported policy initiatives aimed at faster response and broader awareness. The case also influenced how support services address ambiguity, helping families cope during prolonged investigations. Counselors highlighted the importance of communication, transparency, and realistic expectation setting. Emily's disappearance provided a framework for these practices. In academic circles, the case remains cited for its demonstration of pattern recognition over isolated facts. Students studying criminology and psychology analyze the timeline as an exercise in applied reasoning. Emily Carter's story thus persists as an educational tool, ensuring that the circumstances surrounding her disappearance continue contributing to safer responses. Her legacy lies not only in the resolution achieved, but in the systems strengthened as a result. Ultimately, the disappearance of Emily Carter stands as a reminder that the most consequential moments in an investigation often occur before certainty arrives. Her case demonstrated how silence can be active, how routine disruption communicates risk, and how early narratives shape outcomes. The husband who reported her disappearance controlled the story briefly, but evidence, patience, and persistence eventually reclaimed it. Emily's life, though cut short, continues influencing how disappearances are understood and addressed. The lessons drawn emphasize urgency without panic, skepticism without cynicism, and trust balanced by verification. Her story affirms that prevention depends on recognizing patterns early and responding decisively when explanations falter. The case underscores that justice is not always swift, but it is attainable when systems remain committed to coherence and accountability. Emily Carter's disappearance will continue informing practice, reminding professionals and communities alike that listening to silence, questioning comfort, and acting on disruption can save lives before absence becomes permanent.